Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to our third annual Murphy Healy Lecture in Irish Culture. We're so pleased you could join us this evening for this enlightening and informative presentation. Our featured speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Stack, recently started a new position as the Executive Director of the American Irish Historical Society in New York City. I'm sure she'll be sharing more about her new endeavors in just a few minutes. Dr. Stack is following in the footsteps of our first two presenters, Dr. Christine Keneally from Quinnipiac University in 2022, and Dr. Patrick Conley, Rhode Island's Historian Laureate, who spoke with us last year. I know we all appreciated their knowledge and expertise of Irish culture, and in Dr. Conley's case, we also enjoyed learning a little bit about the rise of Irish politicians and the impact they've had here right in the state of Rhode Island. Providence College has also benefited greatly from the interest and impact of people of Irish heritage have had on this institution. For proof of that, we need look no further than the generous gift of Mr. John Murphy, the benefactor of this lecture series. John has led a remarkable life of achievement. Quite simply, he is one of the greatest humanitarians and philanthropists this state has ever known, having supported a number of churches, hospitals, and educational institutions here in Rhode Island, including Providence College. John has enjoyed a truly unique and remarkable career in finance, banking, real estate, and insurance. Countless Rhode Islanders have benefited from his leadership, his example, and his generosity in so many ways. He's not able to be here with us this evening, but I know he's watching from home. So let's give John Murphy a round of applause. We're fortunate this evening to be able to enjoy the performances of not just one, but two Irish dance groups, the first of which I'd like to introduce to you now. The Kelly School of Irish Dance was established in 2011 by Megan Kelly. Internationally renowned Irish dancers, the Kelly dances have performed throughout New England and across America, as well as at Walt Disney World and in Canada, Germany, and of course, in Ireland. Thanks to John's generosity, the Kelly Irish dancers are here with us this evening, so let's welcome them to the floor for their performance. Thank you to the Kelly School of Irish Dance. Weren't they terrific? Please join me in another round of applause. Now, before we invite Dr. Stack to the podium, I'd like to give Mr. Kevin Murphy, son of John Murphy, the opportunity to say a few words. Kevin.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see all these smiling faces on March 1st. We're that much closer to St. Patrick's Day, so thank you all for coming. It gives me great pleasure to be representing the Murphy family here tonight. Unfortunately, my parents weren't able to attend, but I know they are thrilled to see the event grow each and every year. I'd like to thank Steve Morano and the entire Providence College team. I also must thank Judge Darrigan and Scott Malloy. Without all of you, this would not be the event that it is today. Amazing effort, so please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. As always, you did a tremendous job pulling this event together, so thank you so much. I also want to thank and acknowledge my father, of course, John Murphy, who developed the Murphy Healy Irish Lecture Series with PC as a tribute to his parents, Jeremiah Murphy and Catherine Healy, who immigrated to the United States from Cork and Kerry, respectively, with nothing. As the luck of the Irish would have it, they met in Fox Point, just a few miles from here, in fact, and they married. Unfortunately, my grandfather died when my father was only a few months old, and my grandmother carried the torch. Working 3 jobs to provide for her 2 sons, Jeremiah and John. My father had hard times growing up, especially without a father and barely 2 cents to rub together. So we started this lecture series to honor them, but also to honor the Irish we've never met. The Irish we've only heard stories about. The countless stories of hardship and tragedy, as well as triumph and success. It is incumbent upon us to keep these stories alive. For the Irish in Ireland, the Irish in America, the Irish everywhere, all 4 corners of the globe. Let us remember. Let us reflect upon the Isle of Hope and the Isle of Tears. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to your dad for all that you've done to support Providence College. It is so appreciated. It's now my honor to introduce our featured presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Stack. As I noted earlier, last month, Dr. Stack began work as the new executive director of the American Irish Historical Society in New York City. Previously, she was the executive director of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York. Dr. Stack has a master's degree in 20th century Anglo-Irish relations from the University College in Dublin. She completed her Ph.D. at Fordham University, later taught Irish and Irish American history there, and was an associate director of Fordham's Institute of Irish Studies. Dr. Stack's doctoral dissertation focused on Irish and German immigrants in New York at the turn of the 20th century as they grappled with the immigration restriction movements of that time. Tonight, she will discuss both immigration and emigration trends in Ireland in recent years. Please join me in a warm Providence College welcome for Dr. Elizabeth Stack.
PowerPoint. Sorry, excuse me. Is the PowerPoint loaded? And will I control it or will you? I would rather. Thanks. No, no. Okay, great, thank you. Fáilte rómh a gcuine uaisle agus a cóide go léir, Tá áthas an domhan orm a bheith ann live son mí lá féile pádraig. So that means welcome, distinguished guests and friends, and I'm delighted to be with you in this month where we celebrate the feast of St. Patrick. You know, it really is an honor to attend these events, particularly I think as an immigrant myself. My scholarship and my life intersect in weird ways. So I'm going to try and keep it academic a little bit, but I will introduce, you know, my story first. So my talk this evening will be about Ireland's and emigration story. As John F. Kennedy said when visiting Ireland in 1963, only a few short months before his death, most countries send out oil or iron, steel or gold or some crop, but Ireland has only had one export, and that is its people. In fact, every generation of Irish people in the last 2 centuries has had some experience of migration, whether it be their own or that of family members and friends. In fact, no country in Europe has been as affected by immigration over the last 2 centuries as Ireland. Approximately 10 million people have immigrated from the island since 1800. Considering that the population today stands at about 6.4 million, the number of people who left in the previous 200 years is extraordinary. So immigration has had a massive effect on every generation and on our society. So I grew up in Listowel, here. That's my parents' store on the left, right next door to John B. Keane's pub, if any of you want to visit Listowel. It's 9 miles from the Atlantic coast, and just a few short miles from the lonely stone pier that Brendan allegedly sailed his little curragh all the way to America, if you believe the stories. If you've visited Kerry or anywhere along the western seaboard, you will know that there is something awe-inspiring about standing right there on the edge of the land, looking out over the vast ocean that separates our countries and which so many have crossed. Perhaps living on an island makes immigration inevitable. Aside from economic opportunities or Celtic tigers or recessions, being at the edge or the end of a place must induce a strange sort of vertigo and pulls you out across the sea. In my own family, immigration has been happening for generations. My maternal grandfather was one of 14, and he was the only one who stayed in Ireland. In 1921, when he was a baby, just a few months old, his oldest brother, Mick, who was 16, picked him up from his crib, hugged him, and said, "Jerry, I hope you have a good life." And he went off to Australia, never to return or see that tiny baby brother of his again. I met Mick in Melbourne in 1993, and even though he was by then a very old man, he still cried, describing the loneliness that he spent homesick in those first few months, longing to return home, he used to go down to the dock in Sydney and look out across the ocean, knowing he would never come back. Over the years, he was joined by most of his 14 siblings, but even then it was 40 years before he met one sister, Madge, who settled in Perth on the other side of Australia. Some other siblings went to England, and being so close to home, they were able to come back and forth, and only one, Uncle Cornelius, came to America, becoming a priest in Seattle, Washington. My grandfather was forced, like many men in the 1940s and 50s in Ireland, to go to work in England for extended periods of time, leaving his wife with her mother-in-law at home to raise their 4 children. In time, both sons and my mother would go to England, although their time there, as many people's time in the 70s in England, was not happy, and all 3 of them returned home. The oldest daughter, Anne, spent time in England also before eventually moving to North Dakota, which is not your typical Irish destination in America. And she's still there. One of my earliest memories is of her coming home for my grandfather and her father's death in 1981. Shannon Airport was much smaller in those days, and in fact, the whole family walked her right back to her departure gate. She was wearing green trousers and a short belted brown jacket, and she came back twice to look through this little porthole window in the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she waved out at us in blue kisses. Even then, a modern era, with communication between the countries fast and inexpensive, and the distance covered in a much shorter time, the leaving for her was still wrenching. Anne has only been home twice more since then. The last time was in 2004 when my grandmother died. And I think now, being an immigrant myself, the strangeness of being home when it's not the home you remember leaving, coupled with the emotional drain of having to say goodbye all over again, is just too much for her. I left Ireland myself in 2005 in search of adventure and new opportunities, initially in the United Arab Emirates, where I stayed for 4 years. Immigration was simply something I assumed you did, especially if you were a young single girl who felt that there was more to life than a booming Ireland could offer. I came in 2009 to New York and found a place where I can pursue my studies and which stimulates, challenges, and supports me. My younger sister and her husband went to San Francisco and work in Silicon Valley, and have had 3 sons born here, something which will no doubt complicate their own immigrant story. So as I was saying, my own experience as an immigrant has colored how I view immigration, probably in general. Obviously, everyone's journey is different, but I imagine that the complicated and often contradictory feelings of excitement, fear, loneliness, confidence, and unease is a cocktail that every immigrant has experienced to one degree or another. So I'm going to give you a kind of a broad, sweeping look at Irish immigration patterns. Then we'll look at American responses to the Irish arrivals and how Ireland coped with that exodus. And then I'll quickly look at our contemporary society in Ireland as we're coping with an influx of people. So historian David Fitzpatrick argued that the most remarkable aspect of Ireland's history is, in the later 19th century, is the disappearance of more than half of our population. In the years between 1815 and 1915, over 7.5 million people left Ireland. Donald Akinson notes that Ireland was the only European country to have less people at the beginning of World War I than it had 100 years earlier. For every 10 people born in Ireland after the Great Hunger, at least 3 to 4 were destined to spend their lives in other countries. As Fitzpatrick observed, and as I sort of experienced, growing up in Ireland meant preparing oneself to leave it. So to take the early 1870s as an example, of the nearly 8.5 million Irish people born, more than a third lived outside of Ireland. And so in terms of European numbers, this is an extraordinarily high level of immigration. In 1910, the Irish-born population of New York City was just over 250,000 people. Only Dublin and Belfast at home had larger numbers at this time. By the second half of the 20th century, the likelihood of migration from Ireland remained a rite of passage for those coming of age, especially in the 1950s and 1980s because of economic downturns. Naturally, centuries of movement creates huge ethnic populations in receiving societies. Estimates of Irish descent is problematic, not least due to the influence of identity politics in multi-ethnic societies, but also the voluntary nature of self-identification on a census form. Still, with this qualification in mind, almost 70 million people worldwide profess Irish ancestry, half of whom live in the United States. The number of girls and women who left Ireland also make it unique when compared with other European countries. At least 1/3 of those leaving Ireland in the early 19th century were female. It was half and half during the mid-century, and after 1885, the majority of Irish immigrants were single girls. Irish women and girls as young as 7 were usually unmarried and did not travel as part of a nuclear family. A New York Times journalist in 1887 noted that arriving at the port was a large importation of Kathleen's, Eileen's, Delia's, and Nora's. And the remarkable fact is that most of the young women come across without any attendant. Their passages are often prepaid by relatives in this country, and they confidently expect to be met on arrival. Of course, often tragically, this was not always the case. So millions followed, after the Great Hunger. Of course, the Great Hunger was devastating. Initially, in the early 1800s, most of those coming out of Ireland were, of course, Protestant. Then the Irish island of Ireland got its independence in 1922, and immigration continued. Although in the 20th century, most people would go to England rather than America. During the Second World War, as many as 150,000 Irish people traveled to the Irish Sea. Commentators have variously referred to the 1950s in Ireland as the decade of doom and gloom, the worst decade since the famine and the lost decade. Agriculture still accounted for approximately 2/5 of the working population, and the small farm rural economy, especially in the west of Ireland, was in an irreversible decline. The state dedicated insufficient effort to developing new industries to fill the gap that this created, and so thousands of young people coming of age faced unemployment. The only way that they could secure steady employment and the lifestyle that went with it meant crossing the Irish Sea or the Atlantic. And of course, the benefit to all of this was the remittances. Although they had departed their country in droves, Irish immigrants made a massive contribution to life at home through remittances, which constituted 3% of national personal income in 1960. For certain counties like Kerry and Mayo, remittances were an essential part of the economy, making as much as 10% of the local economy. The mailboat generation, as they were called, who left Ireland for the UK between 1940 and 1970, sent home the equivalent of almost £5 billion to Ireland. Even into the 1960s, when Ireland was beginning to build a modern economy, remittances continued to flow into the rural economy at an astonishing rate. In 1961 alone, an estimated 13.5 million was sent to Ireland by immigrants in the UK, which almost equaled the entire education department's budget of £14 million. And this trend continued right into the 80s and 90s. Ireland experienced an unprecedented period of economic growth from the early 1990s to 2007 with the famed Celtic Tiger. But immigration never came to a halt. Even at the height of the boom, Irish people still left, but in much smaller numbers than in the late 80s or even in the present day. They immigrated for many reasons at that time: adventure, to see the world, to study, to join friends or family, or to find more attractive employment opportunities, especially with multinational companies who were now homed in Ireland as well. Importantly, at this point, most of those leaving did not feel they had to go. And that was a big change from these men in the 70s and 80s. Our Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, at the time when he resigned in 2008, noted unemployment was just at about 5%. He said he was proud to have delivered a modern economy with sustainable growth in employment, and we've brought an end to the days of forced immigration. Of course, by 2013, after the crash, the unemployment rate was high again at 13.5%, and the number of Irish people leaving the country had quadrupled again. Now, although the majority of Irish immigrants in the 50s and 80s went to the UK, the resumption of immigration to the USA was a distinctive feature of the late 70s, early 80s. This restored, to an extent, the usual Irish pattern, which had been effectively ceased with the reforms to American law in the 1960s, which were technically seen as unfavorable from the perspective of traditional European source countries. Estimates of the number of undocumented or illegal migrants varied widely from 40,000 to more than 200,000. While that higher figure is probably wide of the mark, what is not in dispute is that most Irish immigrants of the 80s were undocumented. In fact, the number of legal Irish immigrants admitted in 1987 to 1990 was only 20,000. Ultimately, the problem of those Irish undocumented immigrants was resolved by the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which amnestied certain categories of illegal immigrants, including many Irish, and the various special visa programs, which had the effect of creating new opportunities for Irish would-be migrants to the States. By the early 1990s, up to 16,000 visas were available to Irish immigrants. Now, these programs expired over time, raising the issue of whether the following years would see a resurgence of undocumented or illegal immigrants. But in fact, the resumption of growth in the Irish economy led to a falling off of immigration at home. Nowadays, in a post 9/11, with the restrictions and controls on immigration, it's a lot harder, as you can imagine, for groups of all kinds to come in, although there are still communities of Irish undocumented, and the topic of immigration reform continues to be a controversial one. Now, America had to cope with these successive generations of people coming in. And sometimes they struggled with the idea of assimilation or people becoming American. You're probably all familiar with the 19th century know-nothing nativist movement. And of course, this, really came from British stereotypes of the Irish, who were often depicted as ungovernable rebels who would corrupt not only the political process, but also just in general society. And this followed them across the Atlantic. The most common complaint about the Irish, their clannish pugnaciousness, was frequently criticized. As one observer of city life put it, "The trouble with the natives of Éireann is that there is no purgatory between the inferno of their own country and the paradise of this, that would fit them for entering upon a broader or higher mode of existence. The change is too sudden, and they and those brought in contact with them suffer from it. They rarely understand their own interest. They are made the dupes of others, and their impulsiveness overrides their reason and keeps them at a constant disadvantage." So this prevailing view of Irish immigrants throughout the 19th century was that their character had innate features like superstition, fatalism, unrestrained fertility, and a fondness for alcohol, which worked against efforts to make Ireland prosperous and modern. Of course, nationalist viewpoint in Ireland countered with, the opposite argument that colonialism, religious tyranny, and land-grabbing landlords conspired against the native Irish to keep them second-class citizens in their own country, with no alternative but to immigrate. Seen from both sides, however, the Irish were culturally unadapted to rural American social life. The Irish temperament, unfitted for lonely life, shuddered at the prospect of a wilderness clearing without Irish fellowship. And so we know that even though these Irish immigrants were often from farms at home in Ireland, they do cluster together in cities and recreate the village almost. So in Forum magazine in 1925, Madison Grant, sorry, these are our maids, and that's one of the most famous campaigns in the 19th century, the Know Nothing Party. So in Forum magazine in 1925, Madison Grant, who was author of the best-selling nativist tract, The Passing of the Great Race, wrote an article called America for the Americans. The article mourns the fact that Anglo-Americans, whom he describes as the native American population, were in danger of being surpassed by immigrants who remained alien and immune to assimilation. He advocated that all citizens should register their identification and fingerprints, arguing that registration could then be used for eugenic purposes. And he praised the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 as a much-needed corrective against the waves of undesirable immigrants, claiming it was one of the greatest steps forward in the history of this country. The Johnson-Reed Act, as you know, limited the proportion of immigrants who could come in to a ratio of who was already in by a certain year. So in fact, it actually didn't negatively impact the Irish because we were already in such huge numbers, but it was, very hard if you were in Italian or Greek, one of these newer groups, because you were now only allowed of 2% of who was already in. In fact, he criticized the bill for not going far enough to bar immigrants from countries to the south of America. He took heart from how much support the bill received in Congress, though. And although he doesn't mention Irish immigrants specifically, it's hard not to hear the implicit criticism of them as he discussed life in cities. Where we have a mixture of races, some of the most important elements of our freedom, for which our ancestors fought, have been abandoned. In cities and industrial centres with a large alien population, freedom of speech and freedom of the press are greatly impaired. Everyone knows that it is impossible publicly and freely to discuss the relative value of races and religions, the amount of crime, the feeble-mindedness or military worth attributable to the various alien groups, although these topics are all the subjects of daily conversation in private. So this demonstrates that there was an awareness of different populations at the time and a feeling that poor Anglo-Saxon citizens were being compelled to accommodate other sensibilities. Grant argues that the worst fault of the immigrant population was that they clung to their own identity. The aliens in our midst are not assimilated, as it was fatuitously believed would be the case a few decades ago when the myth of the melting pot was enthusiastically welcomed. Recent discussions in the press have brought out clearly the fact that those who are alien in race and religion have not amalgamated with the native population. They largely marry among themselves, maintain their religions and customs, and retain their foreign connections and sympathies almost without abatement. Now, clearly, this is a dig at, you know, the Irish with their AOH halls and their Catholic churches and their Irish dancing schools. He said, "Our form of government is based on the Constitution of the United States, not the Declaration of Independence. Our institutions are Anglo-Saxons and can only be maintained by Anglo-Saxons or other Nordic groups who are sympathetic with our culture." So this shows that even though the Irish had been in America for, at that point, centuries, but certainly decades after the peak years of their immigration, they still seemed to straddle a divide between the new immigrant and the old stock. They occupied positions of power and influence in culture, education, and government, but they were still vulnerable to charges of otherness. What qualities were desirable in immigrants? What status they should occupy in society? What rights and access to power and systems they should have? Who could become a citizen, as well as what contributions they must make, were the concerns for the native population. Historian Philip Gleeson has argued that ethnicity assumed greater salience as an element in national identity than it had at any time before. Especially during this first quarter of the 20th century, the ethnic factors of race, nationality, language, and so on were issues that sprang immediately to mind when Americans asked themselves, what does it mean to be an American, and what kind of America do we want? The fact that the Irish were still being viewed with suspicion proved that even citizenship did not guarantee acceptance. So this is from about 1886, and the cartoon was called "The One Element That Will Not Assimilate," and it's an Irish guy with the green rebel flag, and she's stirring the pot of citizenship with the spoon of equal rights. So, you know, happy St. Patrick's Day. Which is this cartoon, the day we celebrate, and it's blood, rum, and riot. And of course, the interesting thing about this cartoon is by then, which is 1887, most of the police would also have been Irish. You know, so you can see the police are depicted very beautifully, whereas the Irish have that simian feature. They're kind of half savage, half monkey. This was taken directly from 1830s British cartoons. So here was actually what St. Patrick's Day was like at the time. You know, they were very, very orderly, very intent on showing what good citizens they could be, but also what a powerful voting bloc they could be. So in 1927, with Al Smith, who was the son of Irish and German immigrants, ran for president of the United States, an article appeared in The Atlantic that challenged the credibility of a Catholic president. The article was written by New York lawyer Charles Marshall, who was an Episcopalian, and in it he argued that as a loyal Catholic, Smith would be obligated to accept the authority of the church over the state if a papal encyclical was ever handed down. Marshall challenged Smith directly, asking him whether as a Roman Catholic you accept as authoritative the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, that in the case of contradiction making it impossible for the jurisdiction of that church and the jurisdiction of the state to agree, should the jurisdiction of the church prevail. If you accept both teachings, how will you reconcile them? Now, Smith cannot have been surprised that his religion would be a bone of contention, although he was certainly unprepared for the vehemence of opposition to his campaign. He was very prominent in New York. He had come to focus after the Triangle Factory fire. He'd worked on various education and labor issues. But this did not translate into national exposure or popularity. His loose stance on prohibition, his connection to Tammany Hall, and his New York accent alienated him from certain rural voters. Smith apparently represented an active urban industrial America at a time when rural and agrarian America felt in decline. As a Catholic, his struggles against religious bigotry were often misinterpreted when he fought the religiously inspired Protestant morality imposed by prohibitionists. He was symbolically connected to the hopes and aspirations of all immigrants, but particularly Catholics and Jewish people. So while his private response to this article was allegedly, "What the hell is an encyclical?" He was forced to join with his German Jewish aide, who was a judge, Joseph Prosker, and Father Francis Duffy, the New York priest who had been chaplain to the 69th Regiment in World War I, and he published a response, "Catholic and Patriot, Governor Smith replies." In it, Smith reiterates his record as a public servant and reaffirms the fact that even as an American Catholic, his loyalty is first to the state. "I have taken an oath of office in this state 19 times. Every time I swore to defend and maintain the Constitution of the United States. Your church, just as mine, voices the injunction of our common Savior to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's." He ended with a fervent prayer that never again in this land will any public servant be challenged because of the faith in which he has tried to walk humbly with his God. Naturally, John F. Kennedy faced exactly the same questions in his campaign in 1960. So that was part of how America coped with the influx of Irish immigration in the 20th century. And how did Ireland cope with the exodus? Surprisingly, immigration never led to a breakdown of ties between those leaving and those staying behind on the whole. David Fitzpatrick has surmised immigration challenged certain certainties and invited reflections from both sides on the competing advantages of both new and old worlds. Immigrants were gone, but very much not forgotten. The increase in English literacy after the establishment of the Ireland's national school system in 1831, which gave free elementary school education to people in Ireland before even they had it in England. Now, of course, it was brought into the country to turn them into good British, citizens, but it increased literacy, which was great. And that allowed people to stay in continual contact with each other, as letters became an indispensable agent for sustaining the unity of families and neighbourhoods fractured by immigration. The language used to discuss immigration in Ireland, however, always has been highly polarised and is frequently highly emotive. On the one hand, a strong popular current, which can be traced back to the 19th century, sees immigration as unequivocally and irredeemably disastrous, both for the immigrant and for the country from which she has left behind. There are a few Irish immigrant songs, for instance, extolling the wonderful future awaiting the immigrant on a foreign shore. Most are gloomy, backward-looking, and inclined to idealise home, particularly the place left behind. Inspired by memories of the Great Hunger, oppression, or poverty, as well as by fear of the difficult life the immigrant often faced in a foreign country, the traditional picture of immigration was not a positive one in Ireland. Technically, you can trace this narrative of victimhood back to the 19th century book by John Mitchell, The Last Conquest of Ireland. He says there began to be an eager desire in England to get rid of the Celts by immigration because they were not perishing fast enough of hunger and typhus. But the modern signs are still seen every Christmas on TV as film crews film departing sons and daughters at Irish airports or welcoming them back on vacation. Sorry, that's a happy one. Let's look at that instead. The language of this type of media reporting and popular perceptions, rightly or wrongly, captures a view of immigration as rarely a freely chosen option. References to the scourge of immigration are still frequent in media reports. This Irish Independent article, "The Lost Boys of Lixnaw, Town Laments Scourge of Immigration," from January 2013, is typical. It is a story that's not unique and repeated in countless rural communities across the country decimated by immigration. This photograph of the 4th class of Lixnaw Boys National School, taken in 1996, illustrates the wave of immigration from one village. The 11 boys, pictured smiling in their uniforms, are full of hope about what the future holds in store. Today, only 3 remain in the village. The other 8 have all gone. So in opposition to this, there's Mitchell. In opposition to the traditional picture of immigration as departure or exile, another picture that was more positive and complex, whereby immigration was sometimes positive for the immigrant, began to appear in politics. Particularly, I guess, because the recent generations of immigrants are well educated and skilled and confident. Now people are seeing, it as an opportunity to go, and many of them come back. We have a higher repatriation rate now than we did 100 years ago. Of course, all of this poses a problem for official Ireland. If the country is so wonderful, why are so many people leaving? Answers varied, but the response is usually characterized by the continuity of the history of immigration, and it transcends party political lines. De Valera's reaction to immigration in 1951 was to blame the victim. Immigrants were just in denial. Better conditions were available in Ireland, but it was the siren appeal of foreign lands which was a snare and a delusion. He said the saddest part of all this is that work is available at home, and in conditions infinitely better from the point of view both of health and morals. In many occupations, the rate of wages are higher at home than they are in Britain. It is true in some cases an Irish worker's total earnings in Britain are high, but this is often due to the fact that the conditions in which he finds himself obliged to live are so unattractive that he prefers unduly long hours of overtime to a leisure which he cannot enjoy. There is no doubt many of those who immigrate could find employment at home as good or better, and with living conditions far better than they find in Britain. But they leave enterprises for the development of our own national resources without sufficient labour to enable progress to be made as rapidly as we would all desire. The Irish Times rebutted him. An immigrant is always at the mercy of the country that adopts him. The real fault for his harsh treatment lies with the country that permits him or compels him to go away. Foreign Minister Brian Lenihan, in an interview with Newsweek in 1987, said, "What we have now is a very literate immigrant who thinks nothing of going to the United States and coming back to Ireland and maybe going on to Germany and back to Ireland again. The world is now one world, and they can always return to Ireland with the skills they have developed. We regard them as part of a global generation of Irish people. We shouldn't be defeatist or pessimistic about it. We should be proud of it. After all, we can't all live on a small island." This theme then of immigration as a freely chosen option of a new generation of globalised, highly educated Irish recurs again and again. Mary Coughlin said in 2010, "The type of people who have left, some of them find they want to enjoy themselves, and that's what young people are entitled to do. Moreover, they are coming with a different talent. They are coming with degrees, PhDs. They have a greater acumen academically and have found work in other parts of the world, and that's not a bad thing." Which brings us now to the reverse of what's happening and the recent phenomenon of an influx into the country. So between 1870 and 1930, as I said, almost 15% of those living in the US were born elsewhere. This is a huge number and very noteworthy, and it makes the next statistic almost unbelievable. According to the 2022 census of Ireland, the proportion of people now living there who were born elsewhere is larger than that figure had been in the US. It's 20%. 1 in 5 people living in Ireland were not born in that country. So the great melting pot is not America's past, it's the Irish present. Between 2012 and 2022, 401,000 people arrived to live in Ireland from abroad. As of last year, over 1 million people born somewhere else made their home in Ireland. Almost 750,000 people living in Ireland speak a language other than English or Irish in their own homes. So, there's some statistics here. We had 29,000 returning Irish citizens, 26,000 other European citizens coming into work, and almost 5,000 UK citizens. Some of this was spurred by Brexit when there was a huge influx out of the UK. The remaining 81,000 immigrants were citizens of other countries, including 42,000 Ukrainian refugees. 64,000 people left Ireland in the 12 months up to April 2023, compared with 56,000 the year earlier. And so that is one of the highest figures of departure we've had in the last number of years. Now, it would be crass to deny that racism and xenophobia exist in Ireland, especially for immigrants who are not white. But the settling of such a large influx of people for the first time in our culture and history is a great achievement for Irish society. And it's been done mostly at a local and low level, in communities and workplaces, in schools and churches, in sports clubs and voluntary organizations. Naturally, it's easy to do it, people will say, when the economy is booming. But don't forget, we had a massive property and banking crash in the middle of these years. And so in those years of pain and humiliation, we were fortunate that Irish-born people did not turn on their foreign-born neighbours and scapegoat them. Maybe it's our own history as a migratory people which has ensured that our society has behaved decently. Our own history and identity has been so formed by migration, and we still expect to be able to live wherever we please in the world. But naturally, people don't always follow the golden rule of doing unto others as you would like them to have done to you. But the Irish have had a very long training in understanding migrants as human beings in search of a better life, because we were often those humans. Now, of course, there are problems and implications that we have to face, and migration sometimes just sharpens them and makes them more urgent. And those of you who follow the news at home in Ireland will have seen that there have been protests against refugees or immigrants. Sometimes it's a bit blurry what's going on. So there were riots, in Dublin recently. Some shelters were burned. The media said it was the poverty-stricken population of the inner city, but other people claim it was a response to immigration, and it was probably neither or both of those things. Social media has allowed these kind of pop-up protest groups with diverse motivations to get together. But we do know, thankfully, that there isn't a large right-wing or fascist support base there, and they're not particularly organised. But David McWilliams, one of our best economists, has argued that the failure of government investment to try to keep pace with the rapid expansion of our population is a dangerous situation for any state. Amidst its economic abundance, Ireland is making public goods like housing, healthcare, and transport seem scarce, and this is never good for social harmony. There seems to be little official urgency to think about what the large-scale migration means for our country. Government housing plans, for example, are still based on the expectation of a net migration of 220,000 people in a decade. But 3 years in, that figure has been surpassed. And so despite being almost the least populated country in Europe, there is a feeling that the country is bursting at its seams, which puts pressure on prices, rents, and availability, and ultimately on the quality of life experienced by younger people, both Irish and migrant. Renters are spending an average of 35% of their income on housing, well above the recommended rate. In 2010, for instance, this figure was only 27%, so the figures have really drastically increased. There was an estimated 68,000 people on social housing waiting lists in 2022, which is up from 55,000 in 2018. That's a 25% increase. And as of July 2023, nearly 13,000 people were homeless and accessing emergency accommodation. That number in 2015 was only 3,800. So, huge increases. The interesting thing too is education. 30,000 or almost 50% of immigrants out of Ireland had a third level qualification, but 58% of those coming in had a similar level of education. So this trend appears that Irish professionals fear that they are facing limited opportunities and intense competition in the domestic job and housing market, and they're leaving, even as we're bringing in equally high educated people. And that brings us to one of the comparisons with America. One of the crucial ways in which the US coped with its great influx of diverse people was to create public schools that were not affiliated with any religion, but were a neutral space where children could be equally comfortable. The Irish state has not really been able to achieve this. The Catholic Church owns and controls most publicly funded primary and secondary schools, and while the Church is trying to divest itself of many of them, it hasn't really happened. And so schools that are oversubscribed in cities are turning away non-Catholic or non-practicing Catholic children, leading to kind of charter schools being set up by other groups. And although immigrant communities in rural schools have joyfully brought much needed numbers to those schools. So it is clear that Ireland needs a strategy for coping with this migration. The dilemma is straightforward because, quite simply, the economy and society cannot survive without immigrants. From healthcare to high-tech workers, construction to hospitality, the country would grind to a halt without immigrants, and Ireland, on many metrics, benefits immensely from our hard-working and talented new citizens. And there is progress. Visa and citizenship application times have been reduced. In 2013, 95,000 visa applications were received, which was an increase of 15% in just 2 years, and the approval rate was 91%. In the same year, 30,000 citizenship applications were decided, and there were 18 swearing-in citizenship forms. So I didn't intend to debate, the rights or wrongs of the political history, but there is a phrase that the Irish use, Ar Sca a Céile am Warren Nadina. This was particularly prevalent during the COVID pandemic. The literal translation is, it is in the shadow of each other that the people live. And I think that invokes a sense of community and independence and interdependence, which the Irish have shown both at home and abroad. We've always understood it as an immigrant population, and now we're working to apply it at home to those new arrivals. Immigration changes both countries, the one you depart and the one you arrive in. America is indelibly linked with our own country. Our departed family members, even those who left generations ago and who may have no contact with the old sod, are still, in some ways, empty chairs at empty tables in Ireland. In the same way that Ireland is part of so many Americans' past, America is part of Ireland's future. So if there is a backward looking for Irish ancestors to what their for Irish Americans to what their ancestors left behind, the Irish look forward with pride to what their descendants can do here. Ireland is privileged to share a history and a destiny with America, and we are now finding ourselves privileged to do the same with many other countries and cultures. I am honored to be here tonight. Thank you very much for having me, an immigrant addressing her extended community on the day that the White House proclaimed Irish American Heritage Month. As the old Irish saying goes, may the roof over us never fall in, and may the friends under it never fall out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stack, for your insight and your analysis on a topic of great interest to all of us here this evening. It was a wonderful talk. And now I want to introduce some very special young women who will perform for us this evening. Here at PC, we've been fortunate to enjoy the work and the artistry of some amazing student performers throughout the years across a wide range of performing arts. These women are a shining example of that talent. Please welcome the Providence College Irish Dance Club. Thank you again to the Kelly School of Irish Dance, to the members of the PC Irish Dance Club, and especially to Dr. Elizabeth Stack for making this a most memorable evening. I also want to thank Professor Tim Hoyt from the Naval War College in Newport and the 1916 Committee for the Cayley Club in Cranston. They had originally had an Irish-themed lecture planned for this evening, and they were kind enough to change the date so as not to conflict with tonight's event. I believe there was some information left on the tables. We very much appreciate their consideration. Most of all, thank you to John Murphy and the Murphy family. And at this time, I'd like to kindly invite you to join us in room 112, just outside the doors here, for a generous reception. Thank you all for being here tonight, and go Friars.